Hello everybody and welcome to a video looking at Reconstruction under President Grant. This is part of my series looking at the American Civil War, the causes, the course, and the consequences. So obviously this is part of our consequences. Have a look at that playlist for aspects going all the way across, going back to the early root causes through the war itself and into this period known as Reconstruction. So the key figure in all of this is Ulysses S. Grant. He was a renowned general in the Civil War, seemingly the best of the generals on the Union side, if not the war itself. His military strategy was key in ending the war, and he is renowned in American history as this great general, though not necessarily a great president. During Reconstruction, he initially supported Johnson, but split from him over a number of issues, including the sacking of Stanton, and there's issues around jobs being offered to Grant as to take Stanton's place. He was selected as the Republican candidate in 1868, though although he believed himself to be the only man who could unite the nation, he was not hugely enthusiastic about politics or getting involved. And we'll see that he'd made a number of mistakes, and most of those were down to errors of judgment. He seemed a lot more at home and made a far better judge of character in the military sphere than he was in the political one. He won 214 of the Electoral College votes against 80 won by Horatio Seymour, the Democrat candidate. Grant received 52% of the popular vote, in part due to the hundreds of thousands of votes cast for him by black Americans in the South. So Grant's presidency is one where we're going to see some positives, and we're going to see some of his action in this video, concentrating on his actions in terms of Reconstruction. But it was plagued with scandals and economic issues. Now I'll look at those in more detail in another video. So the 15th Amendment is kind of the key start at the beginning of Grant's term in office. It's proposed in 1869, it's supported by Grant, it's ratified in 1870, and it says that the right to vote should not be denied on account of race, colour or previous condition of servitude. And this seems to be it, doesn't it? This seems to solve the issue in terms of there being black voters forever. But southern states found ways around it, including poll taxes, literacy and other tests to gain access to the vote, and very infamously something called the grandfather clause, which said that you could not vote in a state if your grandfather in the vote unless your grandfather did. And this is one of those kind of moments of kind of slightly evil genius in a way, in that obviously for the generation of slaves, it's meant that former slaves meant they couldn't vote because their grandfathers had been slaves, and therefore they wouldn't have the vote or wouldn't necessarily have lived in that state. They might have been moved around, and that means they couldn't vote, which then meant that their grandkids couldn't vote, which essentially then meant this is something that was perpetuated forever. The main way, however, of stopping black votes during Reconstruction period was down to violence and intimidation, and this was at absolutely horrendous levels in the Reconstruction era. So the 15th Amendment, adding to the 14th Amendment, which gave equality of protection in the law, and the 13th Amendment ended slavery, for many symbolized the kind of the final step of Reconstruction, that legally everything that could be done had been. But of course we know that those legal moves were not enough. So Reconstruction is generally overall considered to have been a failure because, well, in a way a lot of students have studied the civil rights movement that's needed 70-80 years later. And we have that horrendous period of the Jim Crow laws and segregation that runs from the end of Reconstruction through to the 1950s and 60s, and obviously race remains a hugely significant issue in terms of access to rights and treatment by the law in America today, and we've seen all this with the Black Lives Matters protests recently. And ongoing, and a lot of this links back, and you'll see mixed in with that lots of references to the Civil War and Confederate statues and things along those lines. Right, so Grant's electoral victory in 1868 was down to 500,000 black votes. So black votes really did have a big impact at this point. In Mississippi and South Carolina, black voters outnumbered white voters, and this was actually the case in several other southern states temporarily, because lots of the white voters had been barred from voting because of their involvement in the Civil War. During this period, there were 2 black senators, Hiram Revels and Blanche Bruce from Mississippi. There were 15 black members of the House of Representatives, and so we see black representation in Congress. And one of the things, this really starts to make the Reconstruction era stand out, because this is not going to be repeated for a very long time. Rather remarkably, in 1873 in South Carolina, South Carolina's own House of Representatives had 123 members, and 100 of those were black. There were only 23 white members of the House of Representatives in South Carolina. And again, this kind of level of representation, I don't think has been repeated. Now, there were accusations thrown around against black representatives, but in terms of the body of historical study, the vast majority of black representatives were generally very moderate. They didn't go seeking vengeance. They didn't wanting to put in really harsh laws against the white population, and they proved to be as competent as any of the other politicians at this point in time. And they weren't necessarily a completely united group, but looked after the different interests of their constituents. So these levels of black representation really make the Reconstruction era stand out, and there's been a lot of revisiting of this period by historians, where they kind of go, well, we generally used to see this as a huge failure, but let's look at the success that happened. Let's look at the level of black representation there was. Let's look at the impact and effectiveness of black representatives who were elected. Now, there is always a bit of a but with this. Now, the Republican Party at this stage still tended to place white men in the majority of key offices, and they did this mainly because they essentially just knew they were going to get the black vote, so they were trying to attract some of the white vote as well. And the way to do that was to put up white representatives, and which is they did in many cases and in many offices. And there were other Republican supporters in the South, and these were given rather derogatory labels by the white South population. So you had carpetbaggers who were Northerners, who the white Southerners who said had moved south supposedly to profit, though actually a lot of them had come down as teachers and ministers and things like that, and nurses trying to do good work, but a lot of the white southern population labelled them carpetbaggers. And there was another group got an even less friendly name, which was the white southerners who voted Republican and supported the Republican Party, who were referred to by the rest of the white population in the South as scallywags. Now, Grant's kind of major achievements in terms of Reconstruction were faced around what was called the Force Acts or Enforcement Acts in 1870 and 1871. The first of these prohibited discrimination by state officials on the basis of race, colour or previous position of servitude, and it established penalties for interfering with a person's right to vote. And it gave federal courts, and that's the important bit, because what was happening in the state courts, it gave federal courts the power to enforce the act, and it also gave the president the power to employ the army and federal marshals to enforce and uphold this act. And this was because of the violence and the intimidation and the racial discrimination that was still predominant in the South. The Second Enforcement Act of 1871 it essentially gave federal oversight to local and state elections. Again, the elections were the focus of a huge amount of violence and intimidation, and it just took 2 citizens in a town that had more than 20,000 inhabitants to say, right, we need federal oversight, we need protection. The Third Enforcement Act is probably the most famous and one of the major achievements of Grant. It's also referred to as the Ku Klux Klan Act or KKK Act. It's passed by Congress. It was requested by Grant. It made state officials liable to federal court for depriving anyone of their right to equal protection of the law. It made the number of KKK intimidation tactics federal offences. It authorised the president to call out militias to suppress KKK action. It prohibited any suspected KKK member or supporter from serving in juries relating to court cases brought against other Klan members. And so you can see here that Grant and his administration really got a hold of how embedded the KKK was in Southern politics and in Southern society, and this use of federal power really kind of broke the back of the Klan at this point, and really undermined its efforts, and allowed, for example, in 1872, large numbers of black voters to vote again and again. They voted overwhelmingly for Grant, for example. But we see here Grant taking effective measures to deal with one of the key groups of what are referred to as redeemers, groups of people who were trying to stop the progression in the South, to prevent the growth of black rights. Right, the 1872 election, which I just mentioned, is a rather confusing one. So we end up with Republican running against Republican, because the Republicans have clearly split. There's a group often known as the Liberal Republicans, which essentially argue that Grant's administration is corrupt, and bits of it were, and they held Grant fully responsible. So Grant was fully corrupt, which is far less clear. And then, really importantly for us in terms of the story of Reconstruction, they said Reconstruction was done, that it was finished, there was no more else to do, and therefore essentially the military control of the South could be removed, and that a lot of the Republican regimes, the Republican governments in the South, were corrupt and they needed sweeping out. The Democrats felt that they couldn't beat Grant by themselves, so they opted for what they call the New Departure strategy, where they rejected a kind of anti-Reconstruction platform that they'd used in 1868, which had been a real disaster. And so they decided to back the Liberal Republican, Horace Greeley. Now, he was an outspoken critic of the Democrat Party, so this was a really uneasy alliance. And it didn't really work, actually, because Grant won the election very easily, got 55% of the popular vote. He won all but 6 of the states. The election result, if you ever look at it, is really confusing, because what happens is Greeley dies in between the election and the casting of the votes of the Electoral College. And so some people still voted for him in the Electoral College, even though he was dead, and some of the states didn't and voted for other people. Whatever would have been the case anyway, Grant would have won. Following after this, there was a terrible economic crisis across the world, and particularly badly felt in America. So it was a deep economic depression. It started with the collapse of railroad stocks, and this led to massive unemployment and economic suffering in the North and the South. The South was also hit by the huge glut. There was far too much cotton on the international market, which really drove down prices. And many in the North lost focus on Reconstruction at this point, and you can argue that Grant and his government lose focus on Reconstruction at this point as well, because they start focusing on the economic problems. The people are more worried about what we call knife and fork issues, that they're worried about getting food on the table and things like that, rather than worrying about the plight of the freedmen in the South. And it also gives a boost to the Democrats. They're now able to point the finger at Grant's administration and say they're economically mismanaging the country, and they are and offer alternatives. So rather than the focus being on the war and Reconstruction, the focus now moves into the economic crisis and other issues which Grant is vulnerable on, such as corruption. And so the Democrats then make significant gains in the 1874 midterms. Another thing that we see in 1874 is the collapse of the Freedmen's Bank. It's a combination of issues that lead to this. Some of it is the economic crisis that I've just spoken about. Some of it is mismanagement within the bank itself. There is a degree of corruption as well. And this has really significant long-term effects, because not only do we have freedmen losing their invested money, and we're talking millions and millions of dollars, but actually for generations the black community in the South, it loses faith in the banking sector, and not accessing banking, and then having their access to banking restricted when we see the end of Reconstruction, starts to really impact in terms of the long-term economic prospects of that community. Kind of the final act in terms of Reconstruction from Grant's administration is the Civil Rights Act, which passes in 1875, and it's designed to prevent discrimination in hotels, theatres, railways and other public spaces. And if you, just as I say that, and if you've studied civil rights in America, you'll be suddenly going, hang on a minute, isn't there segregation? Aren't there enormous problems with all of this from this period onwards? Well, yes, there are. It has little impact because it's a federal law, but actually most of these things are controlled under state law, and so they're states' issues, not federal issues. And so the federal government doesn't really have the power to stop southern states instituting segregation, which they do following the end of Reconstruction in 77. And so when the Democrats regain control of the South, this act becomes effectively meaningless. Right, thank you for watching. I hope that's given you a good overview of Grant's time in office in terms of Reconstruction and the key actions that are taken. I will be doing more videos on this period of Reconstruction, looking at some of the other issues surrounding Grant's government, and then also looking in a more focused way at the lives of African Americans and the degree to which they improve or don't during this period, and also looking at the end of Reconstruction and why it all falls to pieces. And we'll be looking in that at the 1867 election, which is another very interesting and very odd election. So thank you very much for watching. Please like the video and also subscribe to my channel for more history videos like this, and also there's a good range of politics videos on there as well if you're studying politics, and lots of kind of bits of history and bits of politics in very short bite size in my done in 60 seconds playlist. Right, thank you again for watching.